Welcome back to Brilliant Fishing in Sea podcast. Today we're going to talk about North Carolina's striped bass and hybrid striped bass. Specifically today we're going to talk about their biology and how what we can learn about their biology can help us as fishermen to get out there to be more successful catching fish. And so today I'm excited to have Casey.joubert with us today. She's our District 6 Fisheries Biologist, and she's going to talk to us about how we can take what they're learning as biologists and use that to help us in our fishing. And so, Casey, it's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So, and I kind of briefly introduced you, but maybe if you want to take just a moment, just tell us a little bit about who you are, what it is that you do.
Yeah, so as Jason mentioned, I'm the District 6 Fisheries Biologist. We have 9 districts across the state, and in each district we have 2 fisheries biologists. So I'm one of the 2 in District 6. I work from High Rock Lake down to about the South Carolina border, over to Lake Norman, and then over towards the Sandhills. So pretty much the whole Yadkin chain, and then Lake Norman as well. We deal with all inland fisheries matters. Mostly I work with sport fish, which refers to the fish that people are catching for sport. So a lot of catfish, bass, sunfish, crappie, those species. And we have other biologists in the Wildlife Resources Commission that work with our aquatic wildlife diversity species. So those are like your crayfish, mollusks, the small fish.
Oh, okay.
And then we have, a whole host of other people across the state helping with research and supervisors, hatchery folks, our wildlife officers, all kinds of people. But the small part that I do is the inland fisheries. That's the division that I'm in. And we do a lot of work across our district, managing as best we can our freshwater fish species.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, excellent. Well, I think we got the right person here to talk with us about this today. Sometimes these fish, I just feel like the more that we know about them, the more it's just helpful for us as we go out and fish for them. But so let's just talk today. There's like a bazillion things that I like to talk to you about, like everything from crappie to all kinds of stuff. But today, stocked striped bass and hybrid striped bass. Could you just give us a little background on the current status of that? Kind of what that fishery looks like?
Yeah, so we have stocked, the Wildlife Resources Commission, who I refer to with the we have stocked striped bass across the state for 75 years now. It's actually like the 75th anniversary of striped bass stocking. We started stocking those, and about 15, 20 years later, we started stocking hybrids.
Okay.
So striped bass, as a lot of people know, are an anadromous fish species that native populations live, in the oceans. They come up rivers to spawn. It's the anadromous part. And then they go back down to the ocean. So, as you can tell, the reservoir populations are not normal. We started stocking those. So back in about the 50s, I think, biologists realized that striped bass can survive in reservoirs. They won't reproduce, but they can survive. And so by stocking them, we're just simply introducing another fisheries species to have for anglers to have the opportunity to fish. So we've been stocking those for 75 years. And then hybrids, for anyone that doesn't know, those are a cross between white bass and striped bass. Specifically, the species that we've been stocking, the cross is a female striped bass and a male white bass. And the reason hybrids can be good is because they have a higher thermal tolerance, and they can grow a little bit better in places that don't have the habitat that's necessary for striped bass. So essentially you get the growth of a striped bass, but the survivability of a white bass in some of our reservoirs. So we've been doing the stocking for a long time before I came around. And right now we stock striped bass in 11 reservoirs, and we stock hybrids in 6 reservoirs. We stock a little over 700,000 striped bass and a little over 400,000 hybrids in total annually across those reservoirs. So it's a pretty big effort across the state. And the rates of stocking and that sort of thing kind of vary by reservoir.
Okay. Okay, well, excellent. No, I think that's a great introduction to what we're talking about today. You know, the hybrids versus the striped bass, and maybe sometimes a better choice in certain reservoirs than others. And you know, typically, like in your Yadkin chain lakes, it's all striped bass. Am I correct?
Yes. Okay. Yeah. So we stock stripers from High Rock down to Baden.
Okay.
That's mainly historically what has been happening.
Okay.
There has been discussion about changing that at some point in the future. But as of right now, we're still stocking striped bass in those lakes. Lake Norman is the one that's more recently been changed back in 2013. The commission decided to stop stocking striped bass and started stocking hybrids. And we can get into that if you'd like.
Okay.
The reasons.
Sure. Well, if we have time, we may get into that as well. Well, actually, the next question may lead us into that, and you can decide. But so let's just talk about factors. Okay, we're talking about like water temperature, habitat, forage. How those things sort of impact like which species you stock. So you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So as I mentioned before, you know, like the white bass are able to live at higher thermal temperatures. They have a higher thermal tolerance, which means that, you know, as our waters warm up in the summertime, they're not as stressed out as a striper is, for example. So, you know, a striped bass is made to live in the ocean. The reservoirs are not the ocean. I don't think I'm surprising anyone by saying that.
True.
But so they have a really you know, specific thermal tolerance that they can handle. So about 78 degrees, striped bass really start to get stressed out. And oxygen. So as we all know, animals need to breathe. And so anytime that dissolved oxygen in the water gets about lower than about 2 milligrams per liter, again, the striped bass get really stressed out. So in the summertime, in some of our reservoirs, the striped bass are having to eat so much food just to survive, because they're essentially their metabolic rate, so like how much they need to eat to survive, to not be stressed out, is so high that sometimes, you know, they just don't do well. And that's why sometimes you find these striped bass that are like little tiny torpedoes, super skinny at the end of summer. All they've been trying to do is survive the summer, and they're not able to put that growth in, or that feeding into growth or spawning or, you know, just becoming a larger striped bass. They're spending all of that energy just surviving. And moving around through the reservoir and trying to find food. Whereas a hybrid striped bass, because it has that white bass genetics, its thermal tolerance is a lot higher. So it doesn't get as stressed out in those conditions. So a lot of our lakes, frankly, probably would do better with hybrids, but they've historically been stocked with stripers. People like stripers. There's a little bit of hold on them, and so one of the things we've recently actually done, which some people might have gotten, is we did send out a survey to 25,000 random anglers. Those were randomly selected across the state, and we're actually just now finalizing that data. And so we asked a lot of questions about, like, would you rather have hybrids stocked versus stripers? Do you want to keep stripers in this lake? That sort of thing. And so, sorry, kind of getting on a tangent, but that was a really interesting study to do and just kind of see people's opinions on what species they prefer. Because sometimes it becomes this: do you want skinny striper who might survive, or nice, good condition hybrids? And so that's kind of a question we're currently asking people. And one of the other factors is, of course, our hatchery. So for those that don't know, our striped bass that we stock and our hybrids, they don't just unfortunately magically appear in the hatchery truck. We actually have to go out and catch the brood fish, or the adults. So we go out, we electrofish, and catch adult stripers. And then the hatchery trucks come and pick those up. Our hatchery folks do a huge amount of work to take those fish into the hatchery, spawn them, grow them, and then put them back into our lakes. And so that all happens pretty quickly. It's all between about April and June, between getting the fish and spawning them and stocking them. But that is a big effort. And it takes up hatchery space, and there's also certainly, only those certain months of the year that we can even do that. So right now, our hatcheries are at capacity. So, if you said to me, well, I want High Rock to have hybrids too, then my response would be, well, which lake do you want me to take stripers out of? Because, or do you want me to reduce the stripers stocking rate in High Rock? Because unfortunately right now we're at capacity. So if we're going to make more of something, we're going to make less of something else.
Okay.
So
no, that does
all
make
kind
sense.
of trade-offs in the long
Sure.
run.
Well, that does make sense. Yeah. So, and I've noticed some of the things you're talking about. Like if you just say like on Baden Lake, for instance, this summer I was catching 26, 27-inch striped bass that only weighed 5 pounds.
Yeah.
And so they were really long and skinny. So that same, no, obviously like your hybrid striped bass, they're not going to grow as long per se, but they're going to keep the weight on better throughout the summer. Their metabolism's not going to cause them to necessarily like lose weight through the summer.
Yeah, so they should do a better job of holding on to that weight. Again, we'd have to kind of stock the species out there to see how they do, but
Sure, yeah.
But yeah, as an example, I looked at my data quickly. We're still processing the data. We haven't aged the fish yet, but we collected hybrids in Lake Norman and stripers in Baden in December of 2023, so just pretty recently.
Okay.
And I went back and looked quick, and an average fish on Baden that we caught was 20 inches and 3.7 pounds. That's just like on average. And then Norman, our hybrids, were 20.2 inches and 4 pounds. So our average weight and length of hybrids on Lake Norman was actually greater than the stripers on Baden. Now, the maximum fish, the largest fish we caught out of those two samples was Baden. So again, like you can get larger fish on Baden, but on average, just comparing those two samples, which again is just 2 years of data, or 1 year of data at two places. It is kind of interesting though how those fisheries will change through time, and again, like you said, we didn't catch as many of those 26, 27-inch fish, but yeah, it's kind of deciding what trade-off you want.
I'm just curious, what was your big fish from Baden?
I just looked at it this morning. I think it was around 26 inches. Okay. And so that was only using gill netting data from December. We're actually going to go back out in spring and early summer, and we're going to electrofish as well. And so adding that set of data, we'll probably get some larger fish there. But yeah, we use gill nets during the winter. Which is essentially just like a panel net that we put out in the lake. There's buoys on each end and anchors on each end. And as the fish swim into them, they'll get trapped in the net. And we'll set those overnight, pull them every day, and collect fish that way.
Very cool. Well, I think this is probably the $1 million question for all of our listeners here. Because you're a biologist and you get to spend a lot of time studying these fish, excuse me, what are some insights that you have sort of gained studying this fishery that you think might be interesting or helpful or useful for our
anglers?
fishermen?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different things. I would say one thing that I just try to remind people is that fishing is hard. I know that. Catching fish is even harder. But they're fish at the end of the day. They want to eat. They want to spawn. Okay. And they want to swim around. And there's not a whole lot more than that. And so if you can kind of zero in on what they're trying to do at that time of year. So let's say you're out in spring. Okay. The fish, even though their spawning will not be productive, they won't actually create more fish in most instances, they still have the drive to spawn. Okay. So, if you're on Norman in mid-April, I'm going to tell you to go up the river because those fish are making a spawning run. So just like figuring out what time of year and what those fish are doing and the conditions of the reservoir and just trying to think through those things and think like a fish will really help. Every reservoir and every species, whether it's hybrids or stripers, is a little bit different. I would, in winter, following the seagulls. That's what we did in December. We're fisheries biologists, but we still use the tricks of the trade. Okay. So, when we went out to Norman and we were setting our gill nets, one of the first things you can do is see where everybody else is fishing. I know anglers don't want me to say that, but
anglers never do that.
Yeah, we never follow other boats. And also following the seagulls, they're fishing just as much as we are and the striped bass are, or the hybrids. So using those cues. For other times of the year, thinking about that stress that they're under. So let's say you're out there in summer, they're going to be trying to stay in cold water, but they're also going to be following food. So, fish will hang out near the thermocline where that temperature changes because they'll want to dive down into cool water, but they're still wanting to feed. So, thinking, I hate to say thinking like a fish, but, try to think about what they're doing. That certainly can help. I'm trying to think. I feel like my brain's just giving like word vomit of all the different things. Hybrids at Norman, some tricks there. A lot of people use mussels from Food Lion. I know that's strange, but
the mussel militia.
Yeah. We joke that the Food Lions near the lake are probably like, what is happening? Why does everybody wanted these mussels?
Some sort of delicacy.
Yeah, but they're just frozen mussels, and for whatever reason, the hybrids there really like them. So that's something. Live bait is probably always your way to go in a lot of instances. And then during times when there is a lot of thermal pressure, the temperatures are getting hot. I know a lot of people will fish up at the dams. So there's been some changes. I'm not a dam operator, so I won't pretend to know exactly what's going on. But I believe they've added aerators to a lot of the systems in those hydroelectric dams, and that's adding oxygen to the water below the dams. And as I mentioned, striped bass really like oxygen, as I think a lot of fish do. Sure. And so if you're really stressed out in the summer, having that area with a lot more dissolved oxygen in the water is definitely somewhere that you're going to want to hang out. So I know a lot of people will fish below the dams, either from the bank or from a boat, and that can definitely be a good place to go. I know some people have contacted me because they're worried about over harvest in those areas, just because there's a lot of fishing pressure and the fish are really congregated in those areas.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. No, I think that's very helpful. Think like a fish. Right?
Yeah. And also match like the bait and the hook size and that sort of thing. So hybrids will in general have smaller mouth sizes because they have the white bass genetics. Right. So with a smaller mouth, smaller bait, smaller hook, that'll help. And they also can see really well. Generally overcast days, early in the morning, late at night, I feel like it's a pretty hard time of day to be catching stripers at like, high noon on a clear sunny day. You're probably not going to have quite as much success. But, every day is different. That's what I try to tell people too. You'll have days where you go out, you won't catch a single thing, and then another day, you'll be catching tons of fish. But I also like to try to remind people we are stocking the fish. Some people will be like, I'm not having a good year. You didn't stock fish. I'm like, well, we did. But that has not changed. The stocking rates have stayed the same at almost every reservoir for the past 10 years, it feels like. So.
No, good. No, I appreciate you sharing all that. I think that's some good, useful information. I was trying to think, a lot of the questions I think that I've come up with, I think you've already answered. But let me just look here. How about this? Now, here's something that we haven't touched on yet. So what are some ways that, like, the average angler can contribute to, the conservation and I like to use the word stewardship. Maybe that's, I don't know if that's the word that you typically use, but the stewardship, the management of these resources, what can we do kind of on our end? So
probably first and foremost is follow the regulation that's on the lake. So whatever regulation, wherever you're at, following those regulations really helps us. We put those in place with the hopes that people follow them. So that's definitely the first and easiest thing I can think of. And then with regulations, I always, refer to the wildlife resource or the wildlife enforcement officers that are out there, being polite to them, helping them out. That's of course something that's really important. But as far as the fish go, besides following the regulation, would be, handling the fish appropriately. If you're not keeping the fish, to try to get them back in the water as quickly as possible. Not, touching them too much. And a lot of people know they kind of can get your hands wet before you grab them. That protects that slime layer that's on the fish. And that can help them out. And then, as well, pretty much if you catch a fish in like July, there's a pretty high chance that fish is not going to survive. It's called hooking mortality. So if you're out there and you're specifically targeting striped bass or hybrids in those really warm summer months, and you can take the fish home, because there's a good chance that if you release it, it's not going to live anyways. So, or the flip side would be maybe don't fish for them if you don't want to keep them at that time of year.
Sure, yeah, that makes sense.
So that's just kind of something. I know that's kind of a hard thing to deal with, but there's a really high hooking mortality at that time of year. So
does that hooking mortality like change as far as like with the size of the fish? Because I'm thinking like, you catch a smaller fish, you kind of have to release it.
Yeah. So still follow regulations, and a lot of the smaller fish, the hooking mortality is not as high for them. So those larger fish are already under a lot of strain and stress, and so that's where that hooking mortality really comes into play. Yeah, you're right. It definitely makes a difference with the size of the fish.
Okay. Good. So, and I think you covered some of the best practices for catch and release. If you're going to do that, I like to catch a lot of my stripers and release them into a vat of hot grease. But like in the summertime, which I think is nice. If you go out, you catch a limit. Usually, what I'll do is I'll just be done. Instead of just trying to just catch and release, catch and release, catch and release. So yeah, that's good.
Oh, and I will say too, like I mentioned that survey. So anytime that like a survey comes out, or anytime you have anything interesting you want to let me know, anytime anglers want to share information, I really appreciate it. I'll of course give you my like email address. Maybe we can put it up, and people are welcome to send me information. Anytime things seem a little strange, I'm more than happy to hear about the fish you're catching. I like hearing about that.
Okay. No, excellent. Well, we've got time for maybe just a couple more questions, if you're good with that. We talked a little bit about size limits and things like that, and on Norman, I know there's the one lake where the hybrids are getting stocked, and recently they went up from the 16 to the 20-inch size limit. Have you had it kind of enough time to sort of see what kind of impact that's having? Yeah,
so the 20-inch size limit change only changed August 1st of 2022. So that's still pretty recent as far as the fisheries go. So the short answer is no. We haven't been able to see a major difference yet. We did go out and sample, as I mentioned before, in December. So we'll be able to look at that data. And frankly, that data from winter of 2023 was almost pre-regulation data, because you don't have a lot of time that regulation is actually impacting the fishery. So what we'll do is we'll analyze that data. We'll analyze a bunch of other data we have from before that as well. And then we'll continue sampling the population over the next, forever, but at least every 3 years. And we'll see if there's a shift in that size of fish that we collect. But I'll say so far, I've gotten very little negative feedback from anglers. They're still finding plenty of fish. I know from our sampling, 60% of the fish were harvestable. So 60% of the fish that we caught were over 20 inches.
Oh, wow.
So it definitely seems like there's still fish out there available for anglers. But yeah, time will tell kind of with that. And we also did a mortality study. I'm actually in the process of writing that up. We did a tagging project out there, and the fishing mortality was extremely high.
Really?
There's just a lot of people who are keeping fish, which that's what the fishery is there for. I also want people to remember that. We refer to these fisheries as put, grow, and take. So we put the fish in, we hope they grow, and we hope anglers take them, because they're not contributing to the population. They're not making babies. And we're just putting more and more in on top of them. On top of the ones that are already there. So really the point of the fishery is to be there for people to take some fish home. So really changing that minimum length limit to 20 inches is just allowing those fish to be in the population a little bit longer and get a little bit bigger before someone takes them out, because there is such a high fishing mortality in that lake.
Well, speaking of that, so let's talk about, I didn't write this down to ask you about, but I hope this will be okay. So like a 20-inch fish on Norman, how long does it take a hybrid on Norman to reach 20 inches?
I think about 3 years.
Okay.
3 or 4 years. So it's not that long. And they also don't stay in the population that long. So that's something else to consider, is when your oldest fish is 5, 6, 7. Okay. Even at Lake Norman, I think maybe 5 or 6 is more likely, is that once they get to that age, they've been living life hard in Lake Norman, and they might not live that much longer. And so that's where, again, we kind of want people to start taking them out of the lake. But the growth is pretty quick there.
Okay. Well, listen, I think this has all been great information. I feel like there's so much more that we could ask about, and I kind of love to pick your brain at a different time, maybe about crappie fishing or other things. But is there anything that maybe I haven't set you up to talk about today that you'd like to communicate with this kind of group of? And I feel like probably who's going to be watching this is going to be local guys that are fishing for hybrid striped bass and stripers. So is there anything that you'd like to share?
We're out there. We want fisheries populations to do well in our reservoirs, and we want them, to be what anglers want. At the end of the day, I work for the anglers. That's who I'm working for. We're not going to make everyone happy every single day of the year, unfortunately, at every reservoir. But if you have any questions, please reach out to me. One of the hardest things as an agency and as biologists is just that gap in communication between anglers. So doing things like this, of course, helps, and that's why I'm thrilled that you asked me on here today. But, anytime people have questions, email, text, phone calls, I'm happy to speak with people. And, just remind people that, these systems are pretty fluid and dynamic, always changing. And if we do change something with stocking, not that anything's guaranteed at this time, but if we do change anything, we can always change it again. If it doesn't work, a lot of our systems, I try to remind people, are kind of giant experiments. We're changing a factor and we hope it does well. And if it doesn't do well, then we can change back. An example of that would be the F1 largemouth bass stocking at Lake Norman, and a couple other lakes across the state. If we do something and we're stocking and it doesn't work, we can always choose not to do it, or we can choose to keep doing it. So, our systems are always going to be changing, but I'm always happy to hear from anglers and get their insight. Okay.
Well, it's been a pleasure, privilege to have you with us today, and we'll link Casey's contact information in the description below if you want to give her a call or an email or text. She loves to get complaints from anglers. So,
good or bad calls, I can handle them.
Well, listen, it's been a privilege and pleasure, as always, spending time with people that know about fishing North Carolina's lakes, rivers, and beaches. And with that, we're going to go ahead and sign off. Brilliant Fishing, out.